Hello, I'm Dan Jones. Welcome to interCHANGE. Thank you so very much for joining us. We have important things to talk about today. Okay, Milwaukee County Sheriff David Clarke grabbing some national media exposure this week with some pretty bold statements about racism and police brutality. Is he right on target or is he way off base? We'll talk about Wisconsin's own Congressman Paul Ryan becoming the new Speaker of the House. So does this mean he becomes a more effective or less effective congressman for his constituents? And we will discuss a call for higher taxes to provide more funding for the arts and other cultural offerings in Milwaukee. Before we get going, please let me introduce everybody. You know longtime newspaper columnist Joel McNally, and Gerard, Randall, education and job creation consultant. And of course, Denise Callaway, former TV news reporter, now a communications and public relations professional. Rick Horowitz will be along with commentary at the end of the show. All right, let's talk first about Sheriff David Clarke, telling Fox News and the World this week that there is no police brutality and that law enforcement officers aren't racist. Follows that up with a tweet that Black Lives Matter movement will probably join forces with ISIS. Over the top, or is he just standing up for the cops on the street who are constantly getting beat up by the media? Denise, I know you're a big fan of David Clarke.
Oh, well, words can't describe. I just don't know what he was thinking. I, for one, would like to believe that he was right and there was no police brutality since 1960. But unfortunately, lives lost, judgments that have come down, and millions of dollars that have been paid out have shown that there have been cases of police brutality. I think that the big problem, well, one of the problems with what he said is, again, his ability to kind of overgeneralize, to sensationalize things. And so to say that there is no police brutality doesn't recognize the fact that there have been cases of police brutality, and it makes it very difficult for him to do what I think he wants to do, which is to say that most police officers are good police officers. I mean, that would be the statement to make that would be true and that people could agree with, rather than something that's just preposterous. And I just don't even have a clue where he thinks that somehow Black Lives Matter is going to join forces with ISIS. I mean, it's almost, what is the most absurd thing that I could say? And I'll say it. I don't have a clue where that comes from. He also made some statements indicating that a study at Harvard showed that there was no racism amongst police officers, and except that nobody, including people at Harvard, can seem to find this study. So, you know, I think that his desire to grab attention, just apparently he thinks it can only be done with the absurd, rather than perhaps statements that he could make as the legitimate law enforcement officer in one of the largest communities in this country, and to make some statements that have some truth and some fact behind them that could cause people to talk about the issues rather than talk about him. But maybe that's not of interest. You know,
David Clarke is somewhat of a media darling, but I don't think there's any real evidence that he's not sincere in what he says. Is he simply trying to make a point that, hey, it's time that the media stands up for cops and not crucifies cops?
My guess is that, well, first off, had he said that there is no police brutality currently that's on the scale or as systematic as it was in police departments across the country prior to the 1960s, he would have had more credibility. He didn't say that. And he didn't come back and clarify what he had said if he thought that it needed some clarification. So on that end, while I'm always willing to give the sheriff the benefit of the doubt and at some point to maybe agree that some of the things that he says are certainly things that need to be said, in this one, he left me more confused, and certainly he made statements that are far more unsupportable than anything that he said in the past. The ISIS statement, I thought, was over the top, because there's nothing that at this point would indicate that those folk who are supporting the Black Lives Matter movement are all of a sudden going to find themselves in some radical anti-American organization or military operation. So I really wanted to kind of picked through his statement to see where there may have been some kernel of credibility, and it was just difficult for me to do. And I think it's difficult for others like me that generally support the sheriff to find something there, especially those of us who's lived through that time when police departments were more inclined to be anti-African American and certainly anti-civil rights protester than what we've experienced today.
Joel, if a white police chief or a white sheriff said these things, people would be even more outraged. If he said these things on national TV, they'd say, what a racist. Is David Clarke a racist?
Yes. Quite frankly, and he's outrageous, and he's ridiculous, and he's actually stopped being Milwaukee County Sheriff a long time ago. He's now auditioning full-time on Fox News, and everyone knows it. He's on there all the time. The fact that this one made headlines, he said other ridiculous things on there all the time. He spends more time on Fox News than he does acting as sheriff of Milwaukee County. He has said, this isn't the first time he's attacked the Black Lives Matter movement, which are basically people standing up for against the murder of black citizens by police officers, and there have been incident after incident of that. There's a movement in this country that's long overdue that police departments and every department except the sheriffs are recognizing, where we're putting cameras on police and we're making rules that you don't shoot first and ask questions later. But look at his venue. He's on Fox News, and you're absolutely right. If a white police officer or even one of their white right-wing nut commentators would say some of the things that Sheriff Clarke said, people would be outraged. People would say, you can't put racist hate on the air, but because he's a black man, he can do it. And let me tell you what else he said about Black Lives Matter. This is a Milwaukee County sheriff, a law enforcement officer. He said they are black slime, they are scum, and they should be eradicated from America. These are black citizens of the United States who are objecting to violence against black citizens. Eradicated from America, it is to get a full-time job on Fox News. I'm convinced he probably won't run for re-election. He hopes to be a full-time Fox News hate commentator as his profession. And it is outrageous, and we should not be paying his salary to perform for Fox News.
I think one of the things that we have to at some point in time, our citizens in Milwaukee County have to ask ourselves, if you have someone who talks about eradicating a group of people, or he also made the statement that police shouldn't protect these people who were protesting. Here you have someone who's making comments like that are in total disregard of the actual laws that he has sworn to uphold and fulfill. At some point in time in Milwaukee County, do we have to ask ourselves, as someone who makes those kind of comments that are in total disregard of the laws he's been sworn to uphold, is that someone who we need to put in charge of our security and our safety? Because one day it might be Black Lives Matter. Who knows who it will be the next?
All right, next topic. Janesville Congressman Paul Ryan was made Speaker of the House this week, a job he really didn't campaign for and didn't seem to want all that badly. So question number one, will he be able to bring the various warring factions together in Washington? And question number two, will he still have the time and energy to pay attention to the needs of his constituents in Janesville?
Yes and yes. Paul Ryan, I think, has achieved a moment that most in politics are unable to achieve. And when the members of his party especially called upon him to step forward and assume leadership for that caucus primarily, to shape its vision, to articulate where the members of that caucus want to go over the next year and a half, I think he deliberated personally with his family, with those who are close to him politically, and came to the conclusion that this was something he was able to do. Unlike any of the others that were in the caucus, because they all had some particular axe to grind, or they had an agenda that wasn't getting overwhelming support from the rest of the members of the caucus. And so he began with that. He began with a significant number of folk in the caucus who shared his vision. And his job, I think, was to get the others to come on board and say, okay, the time for games is over with. Let's get about the business of truly governing and gaining or regaining the respect of those that had voted us in office with an agenda that we'd articulated in the last round of elections. On the other piece, I think he's also set a different tone for what leaders in Congress, and they'll probably welcome this. Those who hold chairmanships, those who hold other leadership positions in Congress spend an awful amount of time fundraising. And he's put kind of a bulk on that, I've got a family. I want to be able to spend time with my family. I think he couldn't have delivered a stronger message when he said this is one of those pieces that it's just not going to be debatable. I'm going to do this, and if you want me to do that, then you have to respect that I'm going to be spending less time raising money, more time helping to raise my children and spending time with my wife. And I think that's just something that has to be respected. Ultimately, the caucus did respect that and gave him the responsibility for leading. I love the remarks that he offered when he was sworn in. I think that will help to set the tone for how the caucus over the next year conducts itself and the kind of message that they're going to deliver to the American people when they begin to run in August of next year.
Denise, you had to think when you saw this news that yes, he was going to take the job and yes, they supported him, you had to think for a fraction of a second, wow, is this Wisconsin guy one big step closer to being president of the United States someday?
Well, there haven't. Being Speaker of the House is not really the career path that most presidents take to that position. So I'm not sure about that. A lot of it depends on what he's actually able to do as Speaker. John Boehner's undoing, as much as anything else, was that he couldn't get anything done as Speaker of the House, and it became known as a do-nothing Congress under his leadership, and that's because he's, pardon the expression, he's wrangling feral cats. He's got so many different fractions of the Republican caucus that it's, I think, going to be a tough job even for someone who, I will say, is as talented politically and as smart politically as Paul Ryan. He is very astute. He is certainly a heavyweight and understands how to make things happen. But I think it's going to be a challenge even for him. I do admire him, quite frankly, for kind of standing up and saying, look, one of the non-negotiables for me is that I want to be able to spend more time with my family. I just think it's really unfortunate that he has always opposed legislation that would give millions of Americans the opportunity to make that same decision. And I would certainly hope that maybe this is a change of heart. And one of the things that perhaps he'll encourage his fellow Republicans to do is to seek and support legislation that will give more people that opportunity through family leave and through sick days to be able to do that. But, I think he was very smart in the way he went about this. He knew he was their choice, and he knew he could cut whatever kind of deal he wanted. Let's see if we can do that same thing for the American people.
For various reasons, the job really did beat up Boehner, and the job really did beat up Newt Gingrich. I mean, they themselves had a lot to do with it, too. But do you have any reason to believe that this job won't beat up Paul Ryan?
Well, boy, he's slick, and the media loves him, particularly the Washington media. And I think he has them totally flim-flammed. I think he's a phony. He lies all the time. He says things that aren't true. I agree with Gerard. The things he said when he made the speech taking the job were perfect. He said all the right things, but he lies all the time. We saw him lie before the Republican convention when he was nominated for vice president. He was basically nominated for vice president as the Tea Party's candidate because everyone thought Mitt Romney was too far to the left because he passed health care in Massachusetts. And he's the Tea Party's. He is a hard right candidate. He's a right-wing extremist. He is the House caucus, the extreme right-wing caucus in the House. It was odd that, hate radio, right-wing radio, hates anybody that tries to lead the Republican Party, were attacking him because he's the most hard right Speaker of the House that has ever existed in history. He's against, he's dismantling, wants to dismantle Medicare and Social Security, unemployment insurance, health care, kill Obamacare. He is the hard right of that group. Now, how he's going to rein them in, I can't imagine. In fact, he's mostly encouraged them as a leader in the Republican Party. And the reason why the hard right likes him is because the media likes him and because he is articulate on television and public. And he can make some of their craziest, looniest ideas like destroying Social Security and Medicare sound reasonable.
I do want to say that's not correct, though. I know Paul Ryan as much or better than anyone else on this panel. He is not out to destroy entitlement programs. He's not out to destroy Social Security. If anything, he's trying to find a pathway to save those programs. No, that's which what he has mentioned time and time and time again.
Destroying a village in Vietnam in order to save it.
Because it won't look like what you want it to look like doesn't mean that he's out to destroy it. But if the idea is to provide security for those who have retired and put money into a system, which is his aim, then I think you have to give him the benefit of the doubt when he begins to talk about how we're going to save these programs.
Not when you look at his budgets and when he was talking about cutting Medicare, cutting Social Security, cutting taxes for the wealthy. All the money he would save out of Social Security and Medicare, he doesn't put into Social Security and Medicare. He puts it into tax cuts for the wealthy. So it's basically taking those programs away from the people who need them desperately and other programs for poor people and giving it to the wealthy. It doesn't even reduce the deficit, which he talks about all the time.
All right, next topic. Can we talk for just a few minutes about the call from the Milwaukee business community this week for more money for the arts and cultural things, institutions like the zoo, the museum, the art museum, the Performing Arts Center? With such an incredibly strong anti-tax sentiment these days, is there any chance whatsoever that the communities in the Milwaukee region would voluntarily raise taxes to increase funding for these kinds of things, Denise? I don't see that kind of environment right now.
I think it already seems like it's a bit of a hard sell. We've already heard folks in Waukesha County saying no, that they think these are primarily located in Milwaukee County, and they think Milwaukee County taxpayers should pay for them, even though it's absolutely clear if you're coming east into Milwaukee any night when there's a Bucks game or a Brewers game, you can't make any progress because everybody's coming from Waukesha County to come to those games. So I think in this environment, it is a tough sell. Does that mean it's an impossible sell? No. But I think while this is, I certainly believe, well-intentioned, I do think it misses the fact that there are a number of different institutions that really have been hurt by budget cuts at both the state and local level. And if we're going to talk about what we need to support, I think we need to have greater community input on what that needs to be. I certainly think arts organizations have been hurt. They were hurt during the Great Recession. Local and national funders during the recession were less likely to fund arts organizations and more likely to fund those programs that were providing safety nets. So some of them have seen decreases as much as 40% over the past 10 years. But I think if we're going to have a community conversation, the arts can certainly be part of it, but that shouldn't be all of it. Certainly, you need to put education into that mix as well. It just needs to be, it's a good starting point. It's not the place where we need to land, though.
Was part of the intent to send a message to Madison, hey, you came through for the Bucks with your big package deal. Maybe you should come through for the museum and the Arts Center and the Art Museum?
Well, if you remember, the original conversation around support for the Bucks also included, thanks to Common Ground, initiatives that would support the arts as well as sports facilities for the public schools. I've served on a number of those boards that are a part of this mix now, and the distinction has to be made between operating cost and capital cost, the buildings. The buildings are in need of a lot of maintenance, a lot of improvements, just because they're old. And the county, which owns most of those buildings or facilities or infrastructure like the parks, they just don't have, under their current budgets, a way of covering those costs. And then when you begin to look at the PAC, the Performing Arts Center, which was flipped over into the new Wisconsin Center District, where they're going to come up with the money is even going to be a hat trick. Then you begin to look at the operating costs for these organizations, and that's when the pool of organizations becomes much, much larger in terms of support for them. And they do have a lot of folk who come in from other communities that support those organizations. Some of them even have people outside of Milwaukee County that serve on those boards. The reality, though, is that we don't have the great philanthropists that we used to have that could continue to put money into the operating budgets for those organizations. We don't have those that are willing to put their names on buildings and continue to endow them so that they can be maintained over the years. And last, if the facilities or if this tax is going to be focused on multiple communities, they're going to want some say in how that funding is spent. If taxes are going to come in from Waukesha, then what about those facilities out in Waukesha that at some point will need to rely on similar kinds of funding? So I think once they can get a handle on operating versus capital and how you get other communities to have some say in how those funds are spent, you might reach a more happy medium.
One minute. The state, the city, and the county all came to the table and came up with an agreement for the Bucks Arena. Do you see that happening here?
No, and I blame tax cut politics, as you mentioned at the outset. Boy, it's not just education needs money. Our infrastructure, our roads, are not only roads throughout the state, but our streets that are destroying our cars as we drive up and down our streets. If all you do in government is cut taxes and you don't have the political courage to stand up for things that need funding, like education, we simply live in a deteriorating community that's going to get worse and worse. It's not just the arts that are hurt, it's everything. And we're seeing it crumble before our eyes. And we don't have politicians who are bold enough to say, look, we can't just cut taxes all the time and maintain the community we want to live in. Scott Walker, wants to continue to build roads in the state of Wisconsin, except he doesn't want to pay for them. And so his solution was, well, let's borrow hundreds of millions of dollars. No, that doesn't solve anything either. You have to be willing. You have to have politicians who have courage to say, you know what, to have a decent community, we have to pay for it.
All right, we move on. All right, back to police behavior for just a minute, and political behavior, too. A couple of recent controversies here in Wisconsin and nationwide have Rick Horowitz asking two big questions. Who's watching our watchers, and what keeps our leaders on the straight and narrow? Rick.
Do you remember, it wasn't all that long ago, when people who held themselves out as law and order types sneered at people who worried about too much scrutiny from law and order types? If you don't have anything to hide, they'd ask, what are you so afraid of? Now they're saying, enough with all this scrutiny of themselves, they mean. Interesting what happens when the shoe, or the electronic ankle bracelet, is on the other foot. What brings all this to mind are two recent news blips, one local, one national. In Wisconsin, once a paragon of clean government, the governor and his fellow Republicans in the state legislature have decided to carve out a scrutiny-free zone that mostly protects, guess who, the governor and other politicians. For more than a century, so-called John Doe investigations have helped hold Wisconsin's political leaders of both parties accountable for violating the public trust. Apparently, the crew running things these days doesn't much like the attention, so they've passed and signed a new law. From now on, prosecutors won't be able to use these John Does to look into political crimes, bribery, illegal enrichment, official misconduct, those kind of things. Something to hide, you think? That's locally. And nationally, some law enforcement groups, even recently the head of the FBI, are floating the notion of something they call the Ferguson effect after Ferguson, Missouri. They're claiming that because of increased scrutiny of police behavior, people with cell phone cameras capturing police misconduct, the police are reluctant to do their jobs. And that reluctance, they claim, has meant higher crime rates in certain cities. Criminal types see psyched-out, camera-shy cops, and they're emboldened to commit more crimes. An interesting theory, if there were anything like hard data to back it up, to establish an actual cause and effect relationship between more cameras watching more cops and more crime, instead of frustrated cops simply asserting it. Meanwhile, examples of police misconduct, captured and posted for the world to see, keep piling up. Do you think every instance of outrageous behavior just happened to happen when a camera was running? Or should we wonder if they're just the tip of a deep blue iceberg? Look, policing is difficult work, essential work. Same with governing. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be watching closely. It means we should.
Well, thanks, Rick, and thank you so very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your weekend.